Hey, how's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm glad to finally have you on, and thank you for joining me today on the stream.
Nice. Good morning. In your case, I guess it's morning in on the West Coast, right?
Morning for me, about 9:30, and should be 5:30 or 6:30 your time?
6:30 my time.
6:30, yeah. Thank you for joining me on your evening. For those tuning in today, I know we're doing it a little bit earlier. I'm heading to Denver for a work thing, so doing a stream on Wednesday this week instead of Friday. And also on a Pareto principle, which is more of a soft skills kind of conceptual idea, which I'm also excited about as well, because it's nice to have some non-technical discussions sometimes when it comes to actually a bit of business management and project management. So.
It actually will be a little bit technical, so it's Pareto principle for a technical point of view, but we will dig a little deeper into this in a minute.
Better said, maybe more. There's going to be some more conversational parts of this that I always appreciate. Now, one thing I would like to do for the people, for yourself who aren't maybe not familiar with you, if you want to give a little background about who you are and kind of what kind of a background you have, I think that would be a great way to kind of start the stream.
Absolutely. My name is Denis Selimovic. I'm originally from Germany, live in Switzerland. I'm since more than 10 years in consulting, mainly focused on business intelligence and actually on the Microsoft stack. So years ago, I started with SSIS, integration services, analysis services, reporting services. And in 2015, after Power BI was released, or 2 months after it was released, I was in a project and our client really wanted to work with Power BI and I had no clue about it. But I had to learn it in this case, what is now good luck for me. So I was fortunate to be in this situation. But back then I was not so happy. And so I'm using Power BI since the beginning, more or less. And I created many trainings. Then I started a blog at one point. I somehow became the co-organizer of the Power BI User Group Switzerland. That is now renamed to Fabric User Group Switzerland. And since this year, I was also awarded as an MVP in the data area. So thank you very much. So my professional life is all about Power BI.
Yeah, and I think you'll be presenting a lightning talk version of this at PASS Summit here in Seattle in November, correct?
Exactly, yes. It's the same title, but the content will be a lot different. So today I prepared a few demos and a few of the principles. But at the lightning talk, of course, I only have a shorter time frame, so the content will be quite different. But you're all invited if you're there to join. I would be very happy to see you there.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get a chance to meet in person at PASS as well.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, we met already at SQL Bits, what was already a pleasure.
And that's right. Yeah, exactly. I'm excited
You
for this
also have a
next one, by
session,
the
right?
way. Well, I was saying I'm excited for the next SQL Bits conference now that they've announced kind of the aviation theme for this, and I'm planning to apply a joint session with Steve Campbell that's going to be there, and hopefully we get a pre-con. But I will be at PASS. I'm presenting on it's going to be a lot of the pitfalls in reports and modeling, often when you're given something with little to no requirements. So that's going to be kind of the focus that I will be going on when I'm at PASS. I have a 1 hour regular session that's there, but it's a little bit of a cheat because I'm, about 15 minutes away from the conference center.
That's a big advantage.
Yep, exactly.
You know that you put the bar very high for costumes this year at the SQL Bits with your wizard
Yes,
costume.
yes. I haven't actually ever worn it on a stream, but it is the embodiment of my avatar, the wizard outfit for that. It's kind of crazy the number of people you end up meeting there. I think it was at least a few hundred minimum people that I had conversations with. And the one thing that gets tricky for me these days is, and maybe I don't know how much you experience this, but there's a degree of when somebody comes up to you and is very familiar with you and excited to talk to you, and then there's a little bit of that anxiety of, wait, do I know you or do you just know me? And you've watched some of my videos. Like, I think Matthew Roach actually wrote a great article on this because he to a degree is a little bit introverted, like all of us kind of are, but he just mentioned that if you come up to me and you introduce yourself, don't make me guess, don't give me the anxiety to have to try to think about how I know you. Just like, oh, hey, great to see you again. We met last time at blah. So like, give me the context of where you know me from, when we've met, or if we haven't, it's, nice to meet you for the first time. That removes all this like need for me to think. It happens like 50 times at a conference. And I liked that I have your name badge at least visible, so I don't have to try to remember what your name is. And it removes so much stress from me. And I like that he wrote like a nice little short blog on just like how to help organizers and presenters relax a bit more at a conference.
Yeah, and sometimes it's also very difficult because you meet so many different people and you just cannot keep track of, especially when you meet them first time in person, because everyone looks a little different than in Teams meetings, and especially also in videos or blog posts, pictures. And then it's really confusing also because you meet so many different people.
Well, and like with us, as you just mentioned, like we've interacted before, and I forgot that it was actually at SQL Bits at one of the times, because there's so many people now that I've met multiple times on a stream. So I think that I've met them in person when I haven't, or I met them in person and I thought it was only online, just because it's really easy to forget how exactly you interacted with them when there's so much online video calls and stuff that we have nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but it's going to be fun. Digressions aside, anyone who is going to be interested or coming to PASS, it's a great conference. PASS and SQL Bits are my two favorite every year. So they're the two biggest ones, and worth coming to, if not for the networking and getting to hang out with people. Like, that's my favorite part, is the community by and far. But at least closing off the conversation around conferences, I can spend all sorts of time talking about stories from there. I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of what we're going to be getting into with Pareto. My experience with it is working with partner Parker Stevens a few years ago, back when he was doing BI Elite videos. I haven't seen much of him for a while, but we did a really great video, which actually we plotted, the Pareto line and everything out to get to that, that 80% and beyond percentage. And we used a couple of DAX formulas to do a combo chart of a line and column chart to basically turn that into one. And it's still one of the more watched videos that I have on my YouTube channel. But I'm excited to get a deeper dive into it with you today for sure.
I'm happy to show you a little bit how I interpret the Pareto principle in Power BI.
Beautiful. Whenever you're ready, I can flip over to your screen, or if we can start from a conversation, wherever you prefer.
I don't mind. I have to keep in mind that when I meet you at PASS, I will introduce you. I'm Dennis from the stream.
This one I remember now. By the time I have somebody on a live stream, it's an hour of conversation. That at least sticks in my brain.
I can imagine.
All right, I'll flip over.
So in general, I prepared a few slides. I will not go through all of them, especially, for example, the introduction. For the moment, I will let it leave by this. The only thing I want to mention is I work at b.telligent in Switzerland. We're one of the big consultancy companies in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and focused only on data, especially on Microsoft data. And of course, I want to also mention my blog, WhatTheFact.bi. And since last week, I also started a YouTube channel. I only have 2 videos, so don't expect too much at the beginning. I also have no clue still what I'm doing, but I hope I can grow and provide some value. For everyone who doesn't know Pareto principle, what exactly is this? So in general, it's named after the economist Vilfredo Pareto, and he's Italian, like our favorite DAX programmers. And he created, or he first time wrote about the 80-20 rules. The 80-20 rule. So this rule applies many times in life. A few examples are, for example, that 80% of bugs can usually be fixed within 20% of the time, and then you have 20% of the bugs that take the most time. Or, for example, with 20% of your clients, you make 80% of your sales. Another example is 20% of your clients are responsible for 80% of the work. These are the very exhausting clients. Or when you look at languages, usually you can do conversation like 80% of the words, 20% of the words are used 80% of the time. And when you think about the Pareto principle, you can really focus on things like this. So for example, in the area to learn a new language, you should focus on the 20% of the words that you will use 80% of the time. Like this, you can already do a conversation, and also a private one. Usually you wear 20% of your clothes 80% of the time. So my interpretation for Power BI is, what are the 20% effort to get an 80% good result? There are also Pareto analysis. This is what you just described, Reed. But I have a little bit of a different interpretation. Like, what if you have a friend? So I talked recently with Nikola Illich about this session, and he said, like, what do you mean exactly with the Pareto principle of Power BI? And you have to imagine it like this: you have a good friend, and suddenly he has to take over and do Power BI reports, and he says, I have no clue what I'm doing. Which are the best tips you give him that with 20% of the effort he can get a pretty good report? And that's actually what I try to mention, and what I try to show with a few examples. Does that make sense?
Well, it's the diminishing return to a degree that we have between the two of those. So it's when is good enough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In general, I've put it down to different areas. So first of all, what can you do in Power Query to improve, or to get the best out of it? What can you do in your data model? What can you do in DAX? And what can you do in visualization? So in Power Query, now I'm curious if you agree with me. One of the most important things, I think, is Roche's maxim. I think you had Matthew a few times also on the channel. And
Yes.
His maxim is, data should be transformed as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary. And that's actually, I think, is one of the most important principles. So best case, you don't do anything in Power Query because you already have perfect data in the system where you get the data from.
I mean, in general, I think I've also loved Johnny. I'm completely spacing on his last name. He's from the UK, but
Johnny
he
Winter?
turned it, Johnny Winter. He turned it into the shirt as
Oh, yeah,
far
right.
upstream as possible. He doesn't have the second half, I don't think, which is as downstream as necessary. But he made a quoted shirt out of that, and I mean it's something that we pretty much every consultant in different words always tells their clients, right? Because there's that question of, is it in Power Query, or do I do it in SQL? Well, it depends on A, your skills, and two, if this is going to be used in other locations, it
Yeah.
could benefit from going into a view, or it could benefit from a data flow, or nowadays like a lake house. But pushing it further towards the source to get more usability and broader access for consumption and reuse whenever possible with your data. So I completely agree to that. And I think that's just, as he said it in a way that was just better articulated than a lot of the rest of us, I think, have said previously. But it summarizes very well a core principle with data modeling and just data management for reporting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did the same things 10 years ago. We just didn't have a nice quote, but I think he sums it up perfectly. And actually, I've seen the T-shirt of Johnny. So Johnny, I don't know if you're listening, but one day I will come back for one of these shirts.
Yeah, I'll see actually if I can find it on his on his website. I'll drop a link in the chat for people. It's a fun shirt to wear, and it's one of those like, damn, I wish I had thought of it, could that into a printed shirt, because that's a great quote to have. That's actually one of my favorites.
And it's also like people who know, and people who don't know have no clue what this shirt is about.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it gives you a chance to like maybe have a conversation. Yeah, but I'm looking it up to see if I can find it. Yeah. Oh, here it is. Yep, got it. As far upstream as possible. There is his shirt for that. So,
nice.
Links in the chat. Cool.
Yeah. So in general, I think one of the things you should do is change the change the data as far upstream as possible. And this also comes back because many times I see also in real life projects that people really like calculated columns for some reason. And it's nice that they like DAX and everything, but usually calculated column you should not really use. So whenever possible, you should already have prepared data. But still you somehow see this all the time. I mean, at least in my projects, I see it all the time with things that you could easily have done before. Another thing I really want to mention is like keep the query folding intact, keep the query folding working.
Yes.
And many times I see, many people are not aware about query folding in general. So I want to quickly show that if you have a Power Query file, or your Power Query transformation open, your Power Query window, and you want to, or you connect to a relational database. Doesn't only have to be relational, it can also, for example, be other data sources that support a query like OData. But in general, now in my example file here, I'm connected to a SQL server. So if we go here to our data source, we see that I'm connected to a Azure SQL database. And I didn't do much at the moment. I just automatically, it's doing the navigation, and usually I would do a few transformations. So probably this column I wouldn't need. Another column probably I want to change. Here we have date and time, but the time is always set to 00. So probably this I want to change to a date. Probably I want to add a conditional column. This took a little longer than I wanted. For example, I want to say, I don't know, if let's add a new conditional column, and I want to say if the calendar year label equals, I have no clue actually what the values are, it's 2019, then it's last century, and otherwise the current one. Whatever you do now, I mean, we do all of these transformations, but what the engine is doing, actually, it's transforming all of that into a SQL query. And you can see that by clicking with your mouse on the last step. This is always the important thing. And at this point, you will see here a view native query. So if you see view native query, it means the query is folding. So all of your changes are included in the query. And you can even see the query and you can execute it, for example, in SQL Server Management Studio. And then if you, for example, change a column name, you would see here the as will change. Here was our case when the calendar year label is 2019 and it's last century, whatever. All of these transformations I just did, they will be included into a query. And all of these steps that I was doing now on the side, they will actually just be transformed into one query. So it doesn't mean it will first load all of the data and then it will do all of the changes. The only thing that will happen is the query from the last step will be executed. And this, of course, is a lot faster because you just have to execute one query against the data source. But you can also break query folding. And for example, if I have a prepared the month and the season, if I want to add the season, but let's say it's a different data source. For example, I would just, this is a static table. I would just add it like this. Let's call it season. If I would add this table and then I want to join it to my date table, we can say merge queries. And in my case, I want to choose the calendar month and I want to merge this with a month here. And after the merge, it found all the matches. So down here, we see it was January, so winter is added. I could add the data, but when I now go to this link, I see that this view native query is grayed out. And that's for the reason that from now on, the query cannot be transformed into a query that can be sent to the data source. And why do I mention this? Because it depends at what point we can do this query folding. So in our case, like last time here, the conditional column still has the possibility to view the native query. This means the query is sent until this point. And from then on, all the changes here, there's a merge is breaking the query folding, and all the changes afterwards, they have to be done within Power Query. And this can have a big impact as, for example, I could also do these steps right at the beginning. And merge I put up and then the expand. So if I go here now, it will look the same. The only difference is when I now remove columns, you see that it's grayed out. This means all the changes done afterwards, after the query folding is broken, they cannot be included in the query. And this would mean, for example, if I only want two columns or something and I want to delete all of them, if I break the query folding at the beginning, all of the other columns will still be loaded and later deleted.
Well, likely also I would say in regards to query folding, like that works most of the time. There are some sources where you can't view the native query even when folding is happening, such as like some of the Snowflake connection types, and there's a few other relational data sources where you can only technically see it, unfortunately, with like actually looking at like a profiler or something else that's seeing what's being sent back to the systems, or seeing what the database system is being received. So it works most of the time. And in Power BI Online, I do know that they added a bunch of extra labels. There is like, it's guaranteed folding, it's likely folding, it might be folding, it's probably not folding, or we don't even know. Like there's like 5 different folding statuses, which I get that it's very complex, but the labels are helpful, but it's also, you just realize it adds to a bit of the confusion when you have 5 different confidence levels on query folding. But at least what's eventually coming to Power BI Desktop, once we get all the major updates to Power Query Online into desktop, you'll get more transparency on folding abilities. But it's a can that gets kicked down the road that I like to describe it as. It doesn't all have to fold, but the further you can transform your data before breaking, the better. And the less rows that are being loaded by the time it has to start downloading the data locally, so filters first, FF, for everything. So any date filters, any column removals, all of the filters that you can apply, that should be right after your navigation, and before any other like transformations happen, because then it's less data to ingest by the time something breaks the query folding process.
And I also remember, I think it was at SQL Bits, Chris Webb did a presentation about query folding. And actually the most important was that it might fold and it might not fold. And this really also, if I remember right, depends on the data source. So some data sources probably can fold it. Like I think as an example, he used OData back then. And in some versions, or depending on some circumstances, it's folding and sometimes not. So even, you cannot say totally for every data source if it will fold or not.
Yeah, exactly. But it is one of the most powerful features in Power Query for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And as you also interesting point, as you said, in general, also it's I totally agree. Highly recommended that you put all of the steps that are filtering and reducing the size of the data set to put it as much as at the beginning as possible.
Yep,
Now, with
exactly.
of course, if it's query folding, it's all included within one query. But anyway, if it's if query folding is broken at one point and you have to do manual steps, or Power Query has to do them, you want to have the data set as small as possible.
100%. Yep, and they'll just be faster refreshes. And I mean it's there's so many other features that are required for it too. Like you can't do incremental refresh without query folding and a bunch of other considerations. But that's my number one takeaway for people is just do an applied step, check to see if you can view a native query. If it breaks, consider that do I need to do this step now, or can I maybe do some other transformations before this step? It's a game of cat and mouse. You're just constantly kicking that breaking change down your list as you go through.
Yeah, exactly. You always want to get as much possible to fold as I said as possible, and then if it has to break, it should break as late as possible. But if you manage to do that, you usually have a big advantage. I mean, depending of course on the data set size and the speed of the source, but usually it's a big advantage when you have a query that is not breaking at all, or if it's breaking very late.
Exactly.
And last but not least, and this also I think is done many times, or is not done as often as I would like to see it, is a proper naming of tables and columns. This is actually no effort at all, but it will make your life so much easier later in the report. And especially if you have different user groups that are interacting with your data set.
So Donald just as a quick thing on query folding. There was he mentioned that like change type didn't break folding. Like it depends on the things that you're going to. You can change from date time to date against a SQL database, that won't break it. But if you're going from text to date, that will. So it depends on the type change. You can go from big int to currency, that's fine. So I think within the same data type, you can do changes appropriately, but you can't convert while with most of the time without breaking folding. So some types of change types work, other types don't.
I think actually in this case I did a change of date type, right?
If you go from if you have a date column that's text and you convert it to date, then that's not gonna that usually breaks. But it depends on the type. So date key, what was date key before?
Date key actually was a date time.
Interesting.
And
because I've definitely done date times and I've had it stick and I've had it stick to a query fold before.
Yeah, also here it worked. Like here you had a date time and I changed it to a date and the query is not breaking, so it
oh yeah, there you
works
go.
perfectly.
Yep. So yeah, see, yep, you got that one worked.
I also remember it depends on what exactly you transform, and also I think on the data source. So this might work with a SQL server and it might not work with a Postgres or something.
Exactly.
But thank you for the question. Yeah, that's actually a good point. Yeah, and I think if you already follow these steps, you already got a good head start with Power Query, because you try actually to do it before, and if not, you try to still with the query folding let the data source do as much work as possible. All right, then we come to our next area, what is the data model. And in the data model, I cannot mention more than enough. The most important thing is to, first of all, have a proper fact and dimension tables usually. And the second thing is to use as a data modeling schema a star schema. Many times I see in my life that either it's not really clear what are facts and what are dimensions. I mean, many times I see mixed data. Reed, I don't know how your experience is.
There's, I mean, you to paraphrase Matthew's quote on upstreaming, like it's as close to a star schema as possible, as much of a snowflake schema as necessary, because you're not always going to get a perfect star schema, and you will have to have some snowflake type, multiple relationship designs, especially when you're doing with many to many, or you're having to, to pass through a few, because there's always complications with that. So yes, in a perfect world, it's going to be a star schema, but most of my models that are on a company of any adequate size with their data, especially that has a lot of layered customer and hierarchies and stuff, somehow there will end up being probably some weird relationship that's necessary
Yeah.
with bidirectional or something else that eventually ends up getting configured. So like that's why I kind of wanted to paraphrase Matthew's quote. So as close as we can get to a star schema.
We need a T-shirt with your quote now.
Right?
Actually, also, I think, like some people do it like nearly religious, that they say it has to be a classical star schema. But I think also at the end, I mean, you want to reach a result and you want to, make progress. So sometimes
Yes.
it's just easier to say, okay, now this would be an additional table, so it's not a star schema anymore, but it's doing what it should do. Or it would be a bigger effort to do it properly. So at the end, it's always a trade-off, I think. But I totally agree with your quote. You should be as close. Maybe I should change it now. You should be as close to a star schema as possible, and still model proper fact and dimensional tables. Also here
Exactly.
as far as possible. For everyone who doesn't know what is a star schema or proper fact and dimensional tables, when you're coming from system development, like transactional systems, you usually find a data model like this if you have an application. And that's also totally fine, because what you don't want is, you don't want that data is repeating. You don't want to have data ready for analysis. Usually you want it for transactional systems. So I don't know, someone is buying something in your online store and one row is written. And these kind of systems, data modeling approaches, they are made for transactional systems, but they're very, very bad to analyze things. So for example, if you want to analyze, a product, and let's take a table very far away, a product by country or something, you somehow have to manage to get the relationship over one of these paths from one side to the other side. And that's very difficult when you want to analyze big amounts of data. So for this reason, in data analysis, you usually try to have something like this. This actually is a star schema. And in the middle, usually you have the fact table, and around are the dimensional tables. And if you have it like this, I mean, of course, in real life, it's a lot more complicated than the AdventureWorks or Contoso example. But this would be a proper star schema. And sometimes you get on the questions, what exactly are facts and what are dimensions? So in general, dimensional tables you can imagine as master data. So every row should be unique, like a product, a city, a customer, a date. Each item exists only once. And usually they're pretty wide, because you can have quite a few properties and a lot of attributes, but they're not very, very long. So of course you can also have quite a lot of products, but usually it's not billions or something. You talk about a few thousands, depending on the company and what you're doing. I've also seen company that have a lot of products, and these dimensions you use usually to filter your report. For example, you want to see all of the products from a specific category, or all customers from an area, or something like that. Compared to this, a fact table then is usually associated with numbers. So you have a sale, amount of products, everything with a number, and you have a link to a dimension. And these tables are usually very, very long, because you want to do many, many sales. But they're not very wide, because you have a limited amount of keys. And again, in an ideal world, the fact table also only contains the IDs from the dimensional tables and the fact themselves. But yeah, in an ideal world, I think usually it's a little different.
I made a note, honestly, to like, I'm going to turn that into a t-shirt now.
I think we will have quite a few t-shirts hopefully after this. Um,
Right?
yeah, I like that actually. If you want an example for dimensional tables, for example, a date table, you would have a date ID. In our case, or what is quite common, you can use something like the year. The next two digits are the month, and the last two are the day. So the 1st of May 2022 would be 2022-0501. And then you have all of the attributes from this date. For example, the day is a Sunday, it's the 1st of the month is 5, the year is 2022, and so on. That's what I mean with the tables can become quite wide. Another one would, for example, be a product table. You can have different products, mountain bikes in different colors with different currencies. And another one would be the customer table. So you have different customers from different cities, from different countries, and they joined or bought in your online store at different dates. And now where all of this is coming together is actually in the fact table. And as mentioned before, in this system, you usually only have in the fact table the IDs, and the IDs are then linked to your dimensional tables. And the dimensional tables are used to filter down your fact table. And usually you have the cardinality, you have one row on the dimensional side, and you have usually many rows on the fact side. So one client is only buying, but hopefully multiple times in your store. And the bike itself exists only once in your master data, in your dimensional tables. But of course, you want to sell the bike multiple times. And now the magic here is in the analysis, now you can analyze everything with each other. So for example, if you want to see your sales on a Monday or on, I don't know, Tuesday, you could filter your date table only on the specific day, like Monday. This table would then filter the fact table. At the same time, you only want to see products with a different, for example, with a specific color, for example, black. This dimensional filter would also be propagated to the fact table and filter also your facts. And at the end, you, for example, want to filter on only clients in Germany. And this is also filtering your fact table. And at the end, you get black products from people that bought from Germany on a Monday. And that's quite really a nice system, because you can combine all of these different filters. And it's very easy if you compare to the transactional diagram at the beginning, because you have only one connection, you filter the facts, and then you can do your analysis on the filtered table. That's at least the system in theory.
Well, one thing too that I've found very useful is ever since we've had visual level filters and slicers, then you can also use the an int of is empty. The SQL.bi did a great article on that, lets you actually do cross filtering between your dimension tables without having to leverage bidirectional relationships, which is really useful as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I read the article as well. Actually, most of the articles are really, really great from SQL.bi. Do you by chance have or can you post this art? Did you have it by chance, the article?
Yeah, I can pull it up and put it into the group chat.
Yeah, I think that would help a lot. The article was very nice. Yeah, but that's actually the first tip. So many problems I see. I mean, Reed probably will agree. Many problems I see at clients that they say they have, I don't know, a slow measure, or they have this problem or that problem. Usually, or many times, they are data model problems. So it's not slow because you have a slow measure. It's just slow because the data model is really, really bad. And you have big tables that filter other big tables that filter other big tables bidirectional. And then at the end, you just have a data modeling problem, and actually not a real performance problem or not a DAX problem. You have a data modeling problem. And from my point of view, I think you have more often data modeling problem that you don't know that they are data modeling problems.
I mean, it's systemic, right? Like the any problems that you have in your model design or anything else propagates down. If your measures are having to account for bad modeling and it's doing more work to transform your data, then
Yeah.
they're going to get a lot slower. So everything starts a bit at the beginning. The proper queries to create the proper table shapes to then make the measures the easiest. Um, if you cannot get a value by simply summing a column, like you're probably already going to start running into issues. If you have to transform a your base sales amount just because the model isn't already set up to be able to just sum a column to get a value that makes sense, then there's extra effort that everything else on top of that has to go through.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end, it's just, I mean, the calculation has to be done somewhere. And as you mentioned, if you have a data model that is not ideal, it has to be calculated, and then you pay with time in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But it has to be done at one point.
Exactly.
What is the next point? Also keep unidirectional relationships. So don't just make the relationships bidirectional until there is a reason. But the reason to have a slicer that is filtered on the possible combinations is not a reason. Also here, our friends from SQL.bi have an amazing article how you can filter a specific slicer for valid combinations. But usually, or many times, there is no real reason to make a relationship bidirectional. And I think from understanding, if you have a big table and this table is filtering another big table, and every time you click something, all tables have to filter each other, it just takes more time to calculate. And usually many times it's unnecessary. So until there's really a reason, I wouldn't do a relationship bidirectional.
So there's a great question that popped up in here that I just want to bring up. So and we can both give our little elevators pitch on this. But do you think AI will one day be able to build out the model?
That's actually pretty good. Yeah, I agree. That's a pretty good question. I'm pretty sure it can improve a lot. I mean, if you ever used in Tabular Tabular Editor, the best practice analyzer, it's actually already doing a really great job. And as AI is able to learn, I'm pretty sure it can improve it, or at least tell us what is not working well. If it's possible to build it, I'm not so sure, because the AI model would have to understand what I really want. But I mean, the technology is evolving so fast. Probably one day it will be able to do that in a very good way. At the moment, the AI features that are already implemented are okay, but they're still pretty buggy. At least the ones that are out.
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's just it's not gonna know how to ask the right questions of the clients yet, and then the scenarios where like somebody's gonna need a lot of these report level things, such as some of the what if parameters, the field parameters. There's a lot of little nuances that go into certain stuff where it might be able to build out some of it, but there's way too many considerations and exceptions, and it's having to pull sometimes from 15 different data sources. How do the key together? Oh, I noticed there's blanks with this. Oh, well, I'm realizing that actually these are technically keyed, but it looks like this value actually is matching, but there are some trailing spaces, so it's not keying right there. There's all these little exceptions and gotchas and parts of dirty data that I think goes into you need a little bit of a human eye on it. Give us 50 years, sure. I'm sure at some point in the future, it will be nearly automated, but there's going to be a bit of a review element that allows us to find that it needs the expertise of somebody truly looking at this and then seeing how it goes down to the visual, and that bar just doesn't look right. Like I can't tell you from a math reason why that's wrong, but like something about this seems off. And being able to then know to go back and see all and fix the data from there.
Yeah, and also, there isn't always a clear solution. It's not like this is the data model and everything else doesn't work. So sometimes you can do it in 2 or 3 different ways, and none of them is right or none of them is wrong. You just have to decide at the end which one you want to do. Like when I think about, for example, you have a header table and the detail table, And you just have to go for one solution. So either you can live with both, or you say you want to merge them together, but then you probably have some measurements that you cannot split down to the single element. So there are a few questions that there's just no right or wrong, that you can just do in different ways, and you have to decide which one you take. And I think also AI is not solving all solutions, but I think it will help us to make our life easier.
Exactly.
But really good question, actually. And already mentioned in the Power Query step, avoid calculated columns, because usually they shouldn't exist, because we followed Matthew's maxim and are wearing our shirts, Johnny's shirts. And at this point, we did already all of our calculations upfront. So we, of course, I mean, ideal world again. But I mean, sometimes there are calculations that are really easy in DAX in a calculated column. And they're kind of complex in SQL or in Power Query. So from my point of view, there are reasons why I would do that in calculated columns because of the effort, let's say.
Anything that requires row scans and the context of the whole table, that's like, so categorical moments in time. So transactional history tables at a customer level or something else. I actually tried to do this recently where because sometimes pre-calculating a flag or a status or a label in a calculated column can make the DAX significantly faster by the time it gets into a measure. I had a stage history table that was opportunities by stage, and what they wanted to do is they wanted a calculation that for any of the stages globally, it wanted to sum X up all of the latest for any particular, let's say, ID. You know, that ID might have 15 stages it's exited through, but it wanted to know the total dollar amount for only the latest stage period for any one of those single ones. And having to do all that in DAX was just a lot of effort for it to look at each ID, determine for all the rows what's the latest date, filtered to just that latest date, then sum that value up, versus having a flag column on that table, which is true false. Very easy to store. You could have a 100 million row table. If you have a binary true false column on that table, you're using basically no space. It's not going to take that much to store. But now every single ID has a row that says yes or no, whether or not for this particular ID, 1, 2, 3, is this row related to their latest states? Now you can just calculate sales amount. Let's just assume that is sales amount where latest stage equals true. Super easy DAX calculation versus scanning and having to do any other stuff where you have to do a variable, find the max and all that other stuff. And so pre-calculating in these exceptions when you need to be able to scan across history or other stuff like that on a large fact table, adding one of those things into a calc column, especially if the cardinality is low, that it does help a lot as an exception to the rule. It's not the normally try doing it in DAX first in the measure, but the alternative is like maybe move that to a pre-calculated column. And those often can be very hard to do in Power Query too, especially if you're doing joins back on itself where you have a staging table. It has to then calculate latest, then you have to do an inner join back onto itself or anything else. It can be very slow in Power Query. It's a consultant answer if it depends. But doing calculations where the context of the whole table is needed to be able to calculate that, especially on maybe like a 45 million row table, it can be a lot faster to do it in a calc column once the data is already loaded locally versus maybe trying to do that where all of this has to be query folded back to the system, and it can be slow and expensive sometimes. So that's usually my stage process of trying to measure first. Can it be done fast in a measure? Okay, can it be done in a Power Query calculated column? If it can't be done in a Power Query calculated column, that final step is a DAX calculated column to move it to. But try to go through that order of where can you do it before using the next one as an exception.
It's actually, I totally agree, but it's actually funny because I had a client case like recently, like before summer holidays, and we tried first with a measure, and it through an exception, out of memory exception, we tried it as a calculated column because it was like 3 lines.
Yep.
Also an out of memory exception. Then I tried it in Power Query. It would work, but it would take approximately 12 hours to load the data.
How did that not time out? Like, I'm like, at least in the Power BI service, I think there's a maximum refresh time of, I should know this. It's a couple of hours, I think, tops. Maybe like
I think it would time out I was looking how long it takes, and then I realized after half an hour he did like, I don't know, just a tiny amount, and then I was like, okay, if he did not this in half an hour, it would take 12 hours to do it. But I think it would be a timeout before. But anyway, that was not a solution. And at the end, data marts were our option. So we could load it in a data mart and use the SQL endpoint. And that solved our case in this case.
Very cool. Okay.
Nice, you always have a few options at least, but usually
Yes.
you should try to put it, again, as far upstream as possible. And but I also agree, always prefer a measure over a calculated column, because a calculated column, if you can solve it, a calculated column always takes space, and a measure can just be calculated on the fly.
I mean, it's really anytime you're starting to get into context transitions that's having to do row scans, that's when your measure is going to slow down. And like that's a whole technical conversation. You can go into that. But yeah, by the time if you're using a lot of the storage engine and you're loading most of your fact table into memory, or a large chunk of it just to calculate and provide the right active rows, that's when you probably start going into those considerations of maybe moving some of those flags that you're needing to do for filters, upstream, so to speak, into either Power Query or to a calculated column.
Yeah, absolutely. But talking about if it's iterating over the rows, if we go now to our DAX section, that's actually the first and one of the most important advices when you, I mean, for tiny data sets, there's no big difference, but in general, you should always try to filter on columns and not on tables. And this we do so many times wrong, because it also makes sense actually to filter on, or yeah, you would think it makes sense to filter on tables, but you should always filter on columns. And what I mean with this, I want to show you in a small example again. So we have here the report from before, and actually when I go back to the report, I have here this visual. It's just a few, it should only be a few different measures. And let's start the performance analyzer and refresh the visual, because this will take quite a while. And there are, I think it's like 3 or 4 different measures. So it should not actually take too long, but for some reason it does. We have here the product name and another 4 measures. If we take a look, I mean, it's the standard AdventureWorks or Contoso database. So our fact table has, I think, 12 million rows. So it's not massive data, but it's also not tiny. It's something in between. Maybe I overdid this example a little bit. But usually what we want to do now is we want to find out why it takes so long. And as you can already mention, we did exactly this mistake to filter on a whole table and not on the single row. And to already explain why this is wrong, or why you should not do this, is the engine behind Power BI is using a column store. So everything you see as a table is internally not saved as a table, but every column is saved on its own. And this means actually the data is saved in different columns. And whenever you want to go and filter on a whole table, the engine first has to create the table and then filter on the whole table that has to be created. So it's always better to filter on the columns and not on the table itself.
Agreed.
Now would be the perfect time that our calculation would be finished.
Just shows you the cost of it too.
Yeah. Probably I should have filtered also, but let's see. My hope is it will finish any time. What is actually, maybe I can show that. If you go to the official, and that's also one of my highlights. If you go to the official Power BI documentation and you look for the filter function, The filter function is actually an iterative function. So it will go row by row over the whole table. So the first argument is a table. And the function itself is iterating over this table, and row by row it will check if this filter condition, the second argument, is valid or not. And depending if this is valid, it will return a true or a false, and then either consider the row or not. This would mean for our 12 million fact table, it's going row by row and really checking if this row is valid or not. And one of the remarks is my highlight, because here it has a recommendation for best practice whenever using filter. C, avoid using filter as filter argument. So that's actually also one of the issues. It's iterative, but you can still use iterative functions. Now it's finished. Shouldn't have taken that long. I mean, you have the product names and different measures. If we go now to DAX Studio, we want to use that to debug the whole thing. We can already see the different measures. I don't want to make this session too long, so give me a second to quickly check which one was the one I wanted to, that is causing the issue. Was it the amount of orders? It was not. It was also not the sales amount, also not the sales last year. As always, it's the last one. Yeah, right. It was the active customers. So if we want to debug this whole thing in DAX Studio, we can just go here and define our measure. So here we will see how the measure looks like. In our case, we just do a distinct count over the customer key. This means we count the amount of customers, and then we filter over online sales. And we filter to all, because we have some offers. We just have people that are in the fact table, but the sales quantity is 0. So we want to filter to all items where the sales quantity is bigger than 0. And we've now seen how long it took. If we go back to our performance analyzer, where is it? Okay, this now took 160 seconds, probably because it was started later. Usually it should take around 40 seconds. What we can do now, we should not iterate over the whole table, but as I mentioned, over specific columns. So in our case, we don't want over the whole table. We want over the sales quantity. And now it should take, let's activate the server timings. It should go quite faster because we just iterate over the distinct values of the sales quantity. And this already exists because of our column store. And if we execute the same query, we should be a lot faster, and we are. Now we're done in 1.8 seconds versus, what was it, 160 seconds. And also, if you look, you have less queries. I didn't show before. Now we only had 7 queries. In the original query, we had like over 2,000 different queries. So one of the best practices is always filter on columns and not on tables in DAX. Not sure if this...
Exactly. Yep. I mean, it's, you materialize in a single column is going to take significantly less storage space. It's still having to evaluate all the rows, but there's a lot of easy ways when you apply a filter function or anything else on a whole table where it might end up materializing that whole table. And if it's on a fact table, that materializes not just that table, but all associated columns from every other table. So you actually get one table with all your fact table columns plus all of the adjacent columns from your dimensional tables. So it's a really big query that's being ran.
That was exactly why I chose this example. But you can improve it by then filtering only on columns. But this was now, of course, also the worst case that you could do on purpose. Another thing I will not show is, but what you should keep in mind is keep your DAX code simple and understandable. You can either do this by referencing for other measures. This I would do if measures are used multiple times. So for example, if I want my sales and I want to use the sales also for last year and previous year, minus 2 years, forecast, year to date, whatever, if you want to use it multiple times, I would do an own measure with it. and otherwise break your code down to multiple variables. At the end, you still have to be able to understand your code and keep it simple and really understandable.
Agreed.
And also, last but not least, always make sure to understand what is the current filter context. If we go back to Power BI, every cell here has a filter context. Every cell is calculated independently. So if you take a look at this number, for example, make sure what is your filter context. In our case, it's of course the internal filter context, so it's this product, but we also have external filter contexts like the region that is probably filtered. Probably we have in the filter panel another filter, and all of them add up to the filter context. And why I mentioned this is if you understand the filter context of the current cell, you're usually able to understand why exactly a specific result is happening. All right.
Filter. Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, at the end of the day, once you confirm that you don't have bad data, it's always an issue with filters, almost entirely. There's a filter that is a filter or row context that is not correct.
Yes.
In part of the calculation. Yep.
But usually you can explain it if you make sure you understand what is the filter context.
Agreed.
And now I would already head to our last section. What is the visualization? I think this probably might be a little more interesting as the rest. Because many times we don't think about visualization. We just, create a report. Okay, read you do amazing reports, very beautiful ones, and you really think what to do. But many times we're not aware that, first of all, we're humans and we have human-like behavior. What I mean, I will show in a minute. For example, you have a specific eye movement, but there are also some visuals you can consume better or worse. And the next slide will be an example. So I want you to check it and see if it works for you. So I'm not sure. I hope it worked. Reed, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like I did go to the top one was the one that I did read last. You'll read this first, and then it's even because your eye is naturally drawn to whatever's biggest, and then after that, generally you go downwards. It's a Z pattern, left, right,
exactly.
top, bottom.
But
and then you just happen to there's something at the top.
It's actually two things. You already said it's the size, of course, but we also naturally have a certain direction to read. So many people have a Z pattern that you mentioned. So you usually would read from left to right, and then I didn't want an arrow. Then you go, Jesus Christ, now I totally screwed up. So you go from left to right, and then you usually go down, and then you go from left to right. And of course, with the size, you usually skip the top and the bottom. Some people also have a pattern that you go from up to down, and then they do kind of a next column. The most common is the Z pattern. But what all of them have in common, you usually start somewhere here up left, and you will somehow go down. And this you should mention or keep in mind when you create reports, because many times I've seen in this left space here, they have all of their filters. And that's actually the worst you can do, because this is where your first and your most attention is drawn to. And you should usually replace this by, for example, putting the slices, the filters on the right side, and do layouts that supports the natural eye movement.
Exactly. And I think with the subtitles too, now that we have in visuals, is one of the many visual updates I think are we would also be able to add additional context. But as you mentioned, it's one of the last things you look at. And with the visual outside of text is, the first thing you notice is the shapes. After that, you generally read the labels, the axis, the X and Y axis, then it's the titles. But there's a similar first, second, third, fourth that you also look at when you observe a visual on a page too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Talking about visuals, another thing we have is the human eye is very, very good in recognizing differences in color. So in this picture from Color, we have 1,735 shapes, and the human eye is really, really good in realizing what is wrong at the first step. So we realize immediately where we have to pay attention, because there are a few things that are, a little different, tiny shapes in color from the rest. Okay, what is going on down here, nobody knows. But except for this, you open this report, you have so many different shapes, but immediately you see where you should pay attention. And compared to this, now another question is, I will show you now another table that is only half the information of this. And you please tell me in which state, for which products we make the biggest sale.
I refer to these as a sea of numbers in general.
Yeah.
Just because, like, the only thing that you can look at from a glance is you try to find the thing with the widest character number of numbers, basically. So I see a couple of 3,000 pound things in there and a few others. So I can briefly find them, but it's difficult. Like, outside
I made it half the size to see it better.
Yeah, there you go. And it's hard. It's hard to look. You have to literally scan the whole table.
Exactly. This should be the message. So although we all love tables, we really love tables, but it's so hard for a human eye to see things. And the difference is we're so good in seeing different shapes of color. So instead, although it's only half the size as the first example, you don't really see anything. And what you can do is to use what we're made for. We can see these tiny differences in shapes, for example, with a heat map. And if you actually take the same table and you make a heat map out of it, you immediately realize where you have to focus. And it's a little bit like the first example. If you go and take a look at this, you immediately see in which area we have the different colors. So you right now know already in which products are selling and in which states we make the most sale. So it's for humans a lot easier to see this kind of differences, tiny differences in color. And it's very difficult for us to see details within tables. And still we use tables all the time. And we don't support them, or not enough, with some color gradient or color shaping that would help us so much more to see the differences. And this is something I also didn't do for for a long time, because I also was not aware of that. But once you start using this, the reports get a lot easier to digest and really to see the details. Of course, you can then still do a drill through and so on to go deeper, but this helps a lot to get a first idea what we usually want in our reports.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of heat maps in general. Anything where, especially when you can hide the labels by applying the background and color formatting, and you basically you get the patterns first, and then you have your tooltips to provide the numbers if you actually need to get into the exact data.
Yeah. Yes, also the bars, I'm a really big fan when you can use them. What I would be very happy if you could drag the same measure multiple times to a table, and you can use it once with a number and once with, for example, with a bar. But at the moment it's not possible, so you have to do a second measure for the bar. But I think this supports already a lot how you can see the data.
So I did there was a video that I did on this, and then I was told about a trick in the comments. If you take the same measure, put it into the visual, change it to show as percentage of grand total, that treats it as a separate measure, and then you could actually format one as a bar next to the original one if you want to show label and bar next to it. But you don't need to create a second measure that way. The visual thinks of them as two different ones if you convert it to the show as percentage of column or column total.
That's actually great to know. I didn't know that.
It's something that I would have never discovered in 1,000 years. And, but yeah, I did the two measure design, and then somebody in the comments, oh, you just have to do this. And well, that's great to know now, but also that is the least obvious thing I ever would have looked at to do something like
absolutely,
that.
Absolutely.
So it's a very hidden feature, but yes, it recognizes them as separate entities, so it doesn't apply the conditional formatting to both anymore when you do that.
Yeah, thank you for this tip. I will definitely try that.
You're welcome.
The next thing, I mean, we talked about it many times, is don't use pie charts, because they're really bad in getting any insight. So that's an example from the official Wikipedia pie chart article. You see here 3 pie charts, and let's be honest, it's nearly impossible to explain which one is ahead in all 3 diagrams. So you don't know if red or blue is leading or black. The moment in pie charts when you have, first of all, more than 2 or 3 slices, and if you have many slices that are in the same area, it's very hard to get a proper idea what the measurement is showing. So that's, for example, is a great example why you should not use pie charts. What is always better are bar charts, because here you have exactly the same information. And actually here you see at one glance, you see exactly what is ahead, if it's ahead for a big amount or if it's just tiny differences. The same also here, that red and blue are exactly the same. I mean, you could guess, but you don't know until you see the bar chart. Here, for example, you could guess. For me, it looks actually the same, but blue seems to be a little bigger. So there's actually no real excuse, in my opinion, to use a pie chart. I mean, they look nice. They look a little fancy on dashboards. And also, to be fair, if you only have 2 slices or 2 items, it's nice to see, because you will see if it's 50%, if it's now 75%, 80%, you see the differences. But the moment you have 3 or more elements, actually more than 3, and they're all kind of the same, it's very hard to see anything in a pie chart.
I would agree similarly with 4 or more. When you have a binary like
Yeah.
true, false, male, female, yes, no, some of those types of things, it gives you a nice cut. Maybe a 3 if you have like yes, no, maybe type of survey answers, but then afterwards just go to a column, or I would say it's probably often going to be a bar chart, just because that displays category data really well, but something with a horizontal or vertical bar.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly, and I think if you follow these tips, if you don't use pie charts, if you be aware of the human behavior, you can improve your reports already by a lot. One more thing, I'm a big fan of the ICBS, now IBCS, it should be the International Business Communication Standards. It's in Europe quite known standards. I mean, probably you know Zebra BI, and they are following this standard as well. Let me correct that quickly. So, IBC, as I said, is a standard. It has many rules. Not all of them are you really have to do, but there are some really great rules that they recommend. And one of them is you should give colors a meaning. And the second rule there I would recommend is to condense information, and actually less is more. So make your visuals a lot simpler, because as a human we also have restrictions. We cannot take unlimited information. We can only take so much information. So the less information you give, the better it is to really understand your report. And here I also want to give a quick example in Power BI. We have the same file, and we have, or we had here, a graphic, for example, only orders by calendar month label. Power BI changed this in the meantime. At the beginning, when you started with a diagram or any kind of visual, it always had like a ton of colors. Every bar, every whatever had a different color. And now slowly they changed it, so now they have only one color. And actually, when you change that, and now I have always I'm still struggling with a new format panel. Let's see how we can change the color. I think at bars. If you would change this only, for example, to one color, let's say, for example, now he's only changing one. Okay, then we have to do all manual. At the beginning, it's now, as I said, Power BI and Microsoft changed that, so now all of them have the same color. Doesn't have to be black, can also be another color, but the color should also always be used for the same thing. So for example, if you say this is my current sales, always the current year, for example, should be the same color. As I mentioned, doesn't have to be black. It can also be another color, but you should always consistently use the same color to give it a meaning. So whenever you open a report, you know black is the current values, and gray would, for example, be the budget. So if you train your brain like that, whenever you open a report, you already know what you see, and you don't have to think. This is also kind of a training.
You're creating a
And when
color
you use
legend,
this,
essentially.
huh?
You're creating like a color legend, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The next thing, what I would change, for example, it's too much information. You see here down the number of orders and then the axis. You see here the calendar month label. We see it's a calendar month. We don't have to write here it's the calendar month label. Everyone will realize that. So we can deactivate that, and we have a lot simpler diagram without losing any information. The same we can do in the x-axis, because we already see here in the headline, we have the amount of orders by calendar month label. This probably we could change to month, but we have exactly the same information, but we have it now easier because we removed these two labels. Another thing I would do is actually completely remove the x-axis and put the labels in the bars. So we activate our data labels. And if you now compare these two graphs, let's take a look at this one first. It's a lot more busy. It's a lot more, more information that doesn't add any value. You also don't see the values really. So if I want to know what is the green one, I somehow have to make an imaginary line down there. So it's around, I don't know, 140K. And when you compare it to the other one, it's very clear. You only have a headline, but the headline tells you what it is. As we mentioned, we already know what the values are because we're trained for the color. And we see here directly everywhere the values. So we don't have to, struggle and see on the axis what the value itself could be. So these, I think, are the two best things from IBCS. Really use colors for with a meaning, and declutter your charts. Try to condense the information. It's enough to put everything in the title, and then you don't need the additional information at multiple other points.
Exactly. And between, I'd say, a lot of what both Lumel does, so they make a lot of the InfoRiver visuals, and then Zebra BI also does IBCS ones as well. And they both basically use the IBCS certification standards for their visuals to adhere to a lot of these principles in the chart templates, the table templates, but it normalizes the variation among colors and labels and everything else. So then it's less things to think about, because this always means this. This shape always represents this. This pattern, this color will always represent this type, this type of data.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also, if you take a look, for example, now at Zebra BI, if you take a look at the visuals, no, I hope I got it. If you open it and you see already the bars have a specific color, you already know that this is the current value, or it would be a budget. You open it and you see it immediately. You train your brain, and after a while, you know exactly what you see without thinking much. And compared to this, whenever you have something very colorful, all the time you have to think what it is. So I'm a big fan actually of these principles. All right, then let's come to our last best practice tips in visualization. One more I would recommend, especially if you have more than a few measures, is to use a measure folder just to organize your measures. And last but not least, and this I also didn't do for a long while, is use the description. It helps you, especially in big models or in complicated models. And I just actually also big shout out for a colleague and friend of mine, Noam Arnold. He was also challenging some of my ideas here. And he just had a huge project where it was impossible to actually realize whatever the measures are without a description. And in cases like this, you really appreciate this feature. What, of course, when you have a small report, all is good, you know your measures. But if you work on big data models, complex ones, you really appreciate the description of the different measures.
And I've also, a couple of years ago, had a little bit of C# script that I use with Tabular Editor, where it automatically takes the measured code, puts it in the description. I think there was an article by someone, might have been Daniel, where you could have used
ChatGPT.
ChatGPT 4 to look at your measure and then to try to explain in English what it was doing, and write like an automatic description. You had to use like an API, and you had to have an account and all that, but there were ways to like have it in plain English, try to explain every measure automatically that was in a model, and scan through and then have it fill in that stuff.
Yeah, that was actually really nice. I think, yeah, I read the article also. I also don't remember who it was. But with Tabular Editor, you could script that, and it helped really a lot by looking at the formula, and it did quite a good job. What doesn't mean I probably would use, or probably I would use it in real life just to get the basic description. But afterwards, of course, you have to correct and see what exactly you want to do.
Yep, exactly.
And if the description is right. All right, and I think from my demos that was it already? How long did we take?
Some questions. Let's pop this up. If there's any remaining questions as well, I see Data is King, you had one. This is coming on screen, but if anybody has any remaining, please feel free to put them now in the chat as we start to wrap up. But Data is King had a great question on, would heat maps be a good option for showing data over a period of time?
That's also a really good question. So over time, usually heat maps help when you have like a lot of data in more or less a tabular format. When you have like a matrix, you have many areas on one side, on one axis, and a lot on the other side. If you have something over a period of time, you usually like use a horizontal axis, and then you try to simplify it by using bar charts, lines, or a scatter plot. I'm not sure if a heat map would make sense there. I think the heat map probably I would mainly use for tabular formats of data. I don't know how do you see it, Reed?
So when I say a period of time, it depends on what it is. Because I mean, the heat map that I've used for years in my Google Analytics report that Google itself had in its landing page was a heat map of day of week, time of day. Technically, they're both time dimensions, but it's not something where you actually have dates or anything else specific. You'd filter by something else on, in a slicer, and then you get this nice little spread where you can see approximately, generally speaking, around Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 7 to 9 a.m., there's a lot of traffic or something like that. So yes, time dimensions can work well in a heat map design. You have to be careful of not having it too granular. I would not want a 3,000 cell heat map. A heat map with maybe, these are just very broad rules of thumb, like, 70 to 100 at the most cells, so to speak, because you still need to be able to identify the areas and like ideally hover over an element to be able to get the tooltip from it. So yeah, time dimension can work well. It just needs to make sense when you're looking at something. Like when you look at that and you see a dark spot, can you immediately be like, oh, well, that's because it's X and Y. Like as long as the X, Y coordinates of your heat map make sense paired together, then it's like any other category. You're allowed to be able to just see, is it upper left, lower right, or anywhere in between, but the place on the grid easily represents visually the coordinates between your column and your row categories.
Yeah, and also what you mentioned, I think it also depends a lot on the scenario. So you could also have, for example, things like when was my product ordered and when was it shipped. So you have the tabular format with time, but at the end you use it as a table, more or less. Exactly. And then a heat map would absolutely make sense. Yes.
Yeah, 100%. Good question though.
Yeah, really good question.
Let's see. I don't see anything else on the chat. So like I said, if there's anything remaining, feel free to drop it in now. Otherwise, we can start wrapping up. But this has been really great today. I think in general, I resonate with a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, both from the Power Query perspective, the DAX perspective. There's with any good consultant, I would say in general is rarely going to say there's a hard rule that should be followed 100% of the time. It's the 80% rule. It's the rule that most of the time should be followed, but everything's going to have an exception. There's always going to be times to do other stuff, and putting $1 in the jar of the "it depends" jar, that is an answer that has to be given. My translation to that usually, if I tell you it depends, it's because it's because you haven't given me enough information yet to give you a definitive answer. If you ask me, like, should I use calculated columns? Well, it depends. Give me more information, and for that specific scenario, given enough context and research, I can tell you if it's right for that situation, and 80% of the time it might be. But I think it was nice to be able to see from both the back-end modeling to the front-end reporting perspective, all the scenarios where here are the best practices, but also the exceptions to many of these. Let's see. Actually, this is a great question. So kind of a little bit of an irony there. So IBCS certification relevant in the US, haven't heard of it in the EU. Now, it's a European institution, I believe, right? It's over in the UK, I thought.
It started from Germany, so it used to be called Success, and it was from Professor Hichert, who was a German professor who created the whole idea. And at one point he gave it to this institution, to the IBCS, but the ideas are still the same, and they have certificates, you can do them. But they're within whole Europe, and in Europe it's also quite a standard. I know in US there are some other standards, but the ideas behind most of the things are still similar. Usually in detail they differ.
Exactly. And I mean, the easiest way that I can summarize it is, I think it's the very first couple of sentences in their book is, I want to, like, music has notes. Everybody knows that this note means this thing in music. It is this key. Why can't we have something for visuals where this always means the same thing? So, like, mapping out standards for shapes, colors, patterns, and labels. And it's just, it uncomplicates visuals. So I do like it a lot. It is more popular for sure in Europe that I've seen than in the US, but I think companies like InfoRiver and Zebra BI have helped to start to standardize that, put it into Power BI, and create these, reuse the templates, and allow us to have visualizations that adhere to those. So I'm very much a component of it. And I'll do this as one final takeaway. I think it's Crossed, Outlined, and Hatched is the name of their book. From IBCA, here it is, Solid, Outlined, and Hatched. That is the name of their book. Here's the link on Amazon. It's a very good read if you are curious about, like, reading on some of this. So I'd recommend that as it's a good table read if you're wanting to learn how to create better visualizations and understand some of the gotchas and overcomplications that you can have. So I have a copy of it over on my shelf. But otherwise, I want to just thank you so much for coming on today. This has been fantastic, and I appreciate all the kind of the insights and conversations that we could have around a lot of the topics from the modeling and reporting perspective. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure also from my side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will be so I'm seeing you at least at PASS. Perchance, are you going to be at Data Mines in Belgium?
No, it was, I have a private appointment at the same time, so I couldn't go.
Okay.
But I also had it in my mind, but I cannot make it. You're going in this case, huh?
I will be going. It's my first time this year. I skipped Power BI Next Step, which is where I normally present at least the last 2 years, but they were too close together. I didn't want to do that, come home and turn around a week later. So, like, I'm kind of maybe swapping every year. I'll do Next Step 1 year and Data Mines the following. Otherwise, I'm in Europe for like 3.5 weeks, and that's kind of a long time to be away from home.
Yeah, totally. And I also have the feeling now in September, after summer holiday, there are so many conferences starting, September, October, November. You cannot go to all of them. I mean, you could, but then you don't do anything else anymore.
Fall and spring, it's September, October, and then February, March, and maybe April. Those are the 2 times a year where there's just a ton of conferences that happen. But yeah, I look forward to seeing you again at the PASS Summit, and everyone else, thanks for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and I'll see you next week when I am back from Denver.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.